Satisfactory facade, indentured labor had its ugly side, is demonstrated by the periodic occurrence of strikes and riots from the 1860s onwards on a varying scale in Trinidad, Suriname, and British Guyana. These incidents sometimes involved loss of life. The free Indians usually held aloof for them, thus providing prima facie evidence that the cause of the trouble lay in the conditions of indenture. The authorities regularly denied that the level of wages was a cause of dispute, but the frequency of this denial is in itself suspicious, and there were undoubtedly occasions when it was not true and substandard wages were offered. It seems that conditions were such that a determined Indian agitator could, after the 1870s, easily raise a riot by appealing to a sense of injustice in terms of wages and the hours of labor. It is fair to record, however, that there were many estates where every care was taken of the indentured and even of the free immigrants, and skillful management was always capable of producing good relationships between employers and laborers. Where the law was rigidly adhered to as a complete definition of labor relations, management was bad and morale low. But there were many managers who displayed some measure of imagination. In 1912 to 1913, the final verdict of two investigators sent to the West Indies by the Indian government was very similar to that of an official inquiry held in London in 1910 by the Indian and colonial officers under the chairmanship of Lord Sanderson. Complaints of harshness were rare and labor relations occasionally discordant, while all employers were not equally successful in Trinidad. The relationship between the employers and laborers of all but a few estates includes more intimacy and mutual goodwill than in most systems of employment of bodies of men within our cognizance. Their comments on other territories where indenture was still employed were similar, if sometimes a little less enthusiastic, save that in Jamaica, some managers showed more firmness than tact in managing capacity, and more were sometimes guilty of rough treatment. These investigators, Messer James McNeill and Chaminlal, were undoubtedly too sanguine, but they went on to comment adversely on the one aspect of the indenture system which now caused serious official concern. Prosecutions for various breaches of the indenture were distressingly frequent in Trinidad and British Guyana, though not in Jamaica, and penalties were sometimes too severe at up to tens for the first offense, except in British Guyana. They added that reliance on the courts to maintain discipline seems to have grown into a habit of mind with the majority of managers, and that all should be compelled to rely, as the more capable already did, on their own tact and skill at managing labor. All right, and this would end my reading from Immigration into the West Indies. So now I'm going to read from Cedulants and Capitulants. All right, and before I do, let me give a little context. Again, the people who they generally refer to as the colored people are in fact mulattoes of Moorish ancestry and Portuguese, also Moorish ancestry and Spanish. Some of the other coloreds were a mixture of African and French ancestry. All right. This book, Cedulants and Capitulants, is subtitled The Politics of the Colored Opposition in the Slave Society of Trinidad between 1783 and 1838. This book is based on lectures that were given at the University of the West Indies Mona campus by a senior lecturer in history by the name of Mr. Carl C. Campbell. All right, so I'm going to continue reading from the section that says resistance without violence. If Trinidad had remained a Spanish colony, it might possibly not have had any collective resistance by free coloreds to the civil and political dominance of the whites. With the coming of the English in 1797, anti-free colored policies were stepped up at the same time that the new controlling metropolitan power began to develop anti-slavery attitudes and policies. Thus, Trinidad's free coloreds felt the need for collective resistance and also perceived the possibility of success. Not having any local elected assembly to appeal to, the free colored leaders down to 1825 requested relief directly from the British government. This was unlike the British colonies with assemblies where many years of early appeals to the assemblies preceded the change of strategy in the 1820s. In Trinidad, the main organ of government were a governor and a council. The governor, with or without the council, could make regulations for the government of the colony, including orders affecting the status of the free coloreds. All governors, with the exception of Colonel Fullerton and later acting governor Colonel Young, were hostile to free coloreds, and there were no friendly voices among the all-white members of the council. There was therefore no political basis for an appeal for relief to the governor or the council, for it was these very bodies which had passed the regulations of which the free coloreds complained. In most of the British colonies, with assemblies of free coloreds of the 1820s, were complaining against laws made in an earlier period, sometimes as far back as a previous generation. In Trinidad, Free coloreds in the 1820s were protesting against regulations made or executive action taken in their own times, certainly since 1797, and especially since 1813. It was constitutionally normal to expect an assembly to reverse decisions made by previous assembly. The balance of forces and views were subject to change in an elected body, and each new assembly was not bound by the views of its predecessors. But matters were somewhat different with an appointed council completely dependent on the will of the governor. The views of the governor were that the subordination of the free coloreds was socially necessary for the continuation of the slave society. Consistency of policy was easier in an appointed council than in an elected assembly, and consistency in this case worked against the free coloreds. All right, and I will end my reading for this week's History Live on that note. All right, I would like to thank everyone for joining us on the live, History Live, and as usual, my admonition every week is you do good for yourself. You do bad for yourself. So as usual, I always recommend that you do good. All right, so Odabo, and see you on Tuesday for the Ifa or